can I steal a moment of your time before this episode plays? Thanks so much for listening to Labours of Sports Coaching. The appetite I see for the blend of academic and practical coaching conversations happening on the show is nothing short of amazing, and I'm determined to make this show bigger and better. Now, to help with that mission, please can I ask that you follow and rate the show 5 stars wherever you're listening. This takes maybe 10 seconds and has a massive effect on increasing the show's visibility, and as a result of that, its potential for future growth, which ultimately will enhance your return as a committed listener. Also check out the show's support links for anyone looking to offer that extra bit of backing. There's much more to come for Labours of Sports Coaching, and I thank you for joining and driving our new community. And with that, enjoy this episode. Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching with myself, Mark Carroll. In today's episode, I've got the pleasure of being joined by Professor Cesar Torres, who is a professor in the Department of Kinesiology, Sports Studies and Physical Education. Cesar specialises, however, in the sort of philosophy of sport and the history of sport. Cesar, how are you? Firstly, it's great to have you here.
Good morning, Mark. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me in your show.
Yeah, and I've been really looking forward to today's chat, particularly because it's on a subject that I think everyone has an opinion around, and it's very contested, and I don't think today even has to be around trying to display any one side of the argument, but the way your work actually looks at the argument, it comes at it from a point of view that I think is really helpful for understanding both sides a little bit better in this sort of mutualist view of competition in youth sports. So before we maybe get into that, because and again, for those that are just joined us, we're going to get into talking a little bit about that as a philosophical stance, but then understanding the sort of practical implications for us as coaches and the way perhaps we can carry ourselves in the way that we can work with our players, that sort of thing. So I'm really looking forward to getting into it. Maybe as a starting point, Cesar, would you mind telling us just firstly what motivated you to get into these sorts of philosophical arguments? Because it's quite an interesting sort of space you've made for yourself in academia around this subject.
Well, when it comes to youth sport, it is such a presence in our cultures all over the world that it seems almost inevitable, if you pay attention to sports, to start thinking about all the issues surrounding youth sports. There are so many dilemmas, so many problems, misunderstandings that that seems to be natural to try to reflect, think about all those issues and try to come to a better understanding of youth sport and try to offer some useful tips to improve the practice of youth sport for the practitioners, for the young athletes, but also for all the adults involved in youth sport, coaches, administrators, officials, parents, among other adults who are directly involved in charge of youth sport.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I suppose what makes youth sport sometimes quite a contested area insofar as the different opinions that you'll hear is that we all want to do well by our children, and it's always often with good intentions for why there's so many different reforms that are brought in, but the reforms themselves have got shades of grey to them. So maybe we can speak a little now to this idea of competition. Then what we don't often see anymore things like point keeping with working with kids. We don't often see as much direct emphasis towards the competitive aspect of sport. And that has now been brought in through regulations and policy by different governing bodies, not just in the USA where you're coming from. And I should mention actually out of Brockport University. Sorry, we didn't get that quite at the beginning. But also here in Britain where I reside and everywhere else, even in Europe. What brought about the reforms that we've seen now in youth sport when it comes to competition? Because one of the things that you speak to in some of your work that I've been reading is this idea of runaway individualism. What was that? Can we maybe chat and speak a little bit to that so that we can understand, firstly, why we actually need to control competition, maybe, if we should. I don't know.
As you rightly pointed out, competition is seen as the origin of all these problems in youth sport. And because of this, I would say, misunderstanding of competition, there have been a series of reform attempted by different youth sport organizations to minimize it or even to do away altogether with competition. And as you mentioned, this has led to a de-emphasis of elements such as scorekeeping, standings, playoffs, championship tournaments, even organized teams and leagues and traveling teams. And it seems to me and some of my colleagues that the problem is not necessarily competition, but rather a particular understanding of competition that is the issue. And that particular understanding of competition is what in the literature is known as the zero-sum game view of competition, which reduces competition to establishing winners and losers. So competition takes this structure of a diet. It is an either or affair in which the winner takes all and the loser gets empty-handed. The winner gets everything, the loser gets nothing. In that view, opponents are seen as individuals who have to be conquered, who have to be subjugated, who have to be overcome in the quest for victory. So the zero-sum view game of competition distance competitors. What we argue is that there is an alternative view, a much healthier view, and not only healthier, but more accurate in terms of what competition entails. And this is what the literature says is the mutualist view of competition. Now, the mutualist view doesn't deny that competition establishes winners and losers, but it says that there's something more important in the process of competition, and that is the attempt to establish excellence. And when we see competition in this mutualist fashion, our opponents become partners in the quest for excellence. So in this view, opponents come together to challenge each other with the hope to achieve excellence. For sure, there's going to be winners and losers, but everybody can be excellent or fail to achieve excellence. So the most important element in the mutualist view of competition is the focus on excellence and cooperation. It is very difficult to determine one's abilities and compare one's abilities to our opponent's abilities if we don't have a challenge to our own abilities. So this view, the mutualist view, presupposes moral equality, seeing our opponents as moral equals who have a right to a fair competition, that they have a right to be treated with respect, with dignity. And of course, there is reciprocity. And the opponents have to see you in the same way. So it is a far more encompassing view of competition, and one that is more true to what competition is about. In the end, we want to establish who is superior. We want to determine athletic superiority. The narrow view, the minimalist view, the zero-sum game view takes away, distance the competitors. The mutualist view brings them together and
Mm.
emphasizes on cooperation and excellence.
Mm.
And in order to embark on that quest for excellence, I need to respect, care for my opponent. And I know that this sounds counterintuitive, but if we care about excellence, becoming better, I need to care about my opponent. I need to
Mm.
respect him, her, they, but I also need to have a profound sense um, of care. I want my opponent at his, her, their best, because that's the only way in which we can all grow together in the path towards excellence.
I mean, you say you want the opponent to be at their best, then does that then speak to some of the sort of moral grounds around like sportsmanship, around um, putting your best first and putting, actually challenging them at what is your best? Because this is where I wonder if you might be able to help us understand then where does that view on things then conflict perhaps with some of these new regulations that you see everywhere that permeate the sort of youth sports scene where, playing time's guaranteed, where scores aren't kept? Because I'm wondering around, do any of those sorts of reforms actually help towards this view, or do they actually push us further away from it? Because if I'm a parent or I'm a coach and I'm listening to that initial description of what you gave there, that pursuit of excellence, who wouldn't want to be part of that? Like that's such an amazing thing that is, an amazing way of looking at things. But I don't know if the regulations and the reforms today actually are helping any further towards that view, or are they actually taking us away further? It's a strange one.
But these reforms we have been implemented with the best of intentions. So there is no mind that those who have the competitions have done it because they care about children, youth, young athletes. But we have argued that these reforms are misleading because they send the message that children are competing, but they are not really competing. Right? So they spread a falsehood. The children are engaged in this structure in which they try to determine who is superior, but they are being told that they are not competing. So there seems to be a contradiction here. And once again, the problem with the reforms is that they have an understanding of competition that is not the most coherent, intelligible understanding of competition. So if we take the mutualist approach, there's no need to implement these reforms. What youth, the adults in charge of organized youth sport, to understand what a mutualist view. So there's nothing wrong with keeping scores. There's nothing wrong with keeping standings. They are just a measure of the excellence, the growing excellence that the two sides are displaying. Losing has become a sort of injury in our cultures, and it doesn't have to be that way. When we understand that we engage in competition to test our relative abilities, then an outcome becomes just an indication of where we stand
Mm.
in relation to ourselves and in relation to our opponents. And there's nothing morally wrong with being beaten by a superior opponent or
Mm.
being in the middle of the standings, right? So the mutualist view actually the, puts outcomes in the right place. Now, of course, it is totally fine to be disappointed in defeat. But the key question is, how did we play?
Mm.
Did we play up to our potential? Are we improving? Where do we need to um, improve things in order to be better competitors, and so on? And this is a process of self-reflection. When we are talking about team sport, this is a collective reflection in which we can grow because we see our strengths, we see our weaknesses, we see where we can grow. So winning and losing becomes part of a process, not the
Mm.
most important element in a
Mm.
process. Right? It's not the culminating element of the process. It's one more step, significant, but
Mm.
not the most important.
Mm. So,
If we, sorry, Mark, but if we focus on excellence,
mhm.
then we can put outcomes in perspective. Outcomes are an indication that help us to assess how that process unfolds. But behind every outcome, there's a process by which it was established. The mutualist view would take a look holistically at the whole process, including but not exclusively highlighting the outcomes of competition.
Mm. Yeah, because when you put it that way, it just seems so much more harmonious with the sort of rhetoric that I more typically hear, that we don't want to necessarily be focusing on the story. We want to actually focus on self-mastery, and we want to focus on getting better bit by bit. But by taking away things like the store and taking away things where there is a real acknowledgement that, you lost or you won, we probably are denying young kids yet another metric that they can use to help judge where they're at on that path to self-improvement. It doesn't need to be that we're either one way or the other. It seems like this is just another training modality like anything else. It can, for me, I've always felt it's dosage that matters, or perhaps the use of it. But this is where the sort of crux of this conversation is leading to. It's that this seems to be about how people approach competition, what attitude people have towards it, and how do they use it, because that's probably where there's problems, not competition. Competition is there, it's innate to sport. How can you do a sport without there being a competitive element to it? And again, we can return to this, but I want to rewind just a little bit, Cesar, because I don't know if you were deliberately putting any emphasis on the sort of introspective component to it, because it seems like when I look at your work, you speak a lot about agency and about the trying to develop the agency of the child to foster their hopefully over time having less and less dependence on other people and those sorts of things. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that with this sort of mutualist philosophy and view? Because I think there's something more to that we can get to.
Sure. Sometimes when we are working within youth sports settings, we just assume what children are. And I think that it's important to reflect, what does it mean to be a child? And I subscribe to a perspective that says that children are uh, developing agents. Right? They are in this quest to find their own voice, to develop their own agency, as you put it, or to become autonomous agents. For many philosophers, this allows a temporal paternalist or parentalist attitude to protect the children, but also to guide them towards this autonomous being. So childhood is it's a predicament. Childhood has, of course, its own goods, only achievable during childhood, but childhood is at the same time this period of life in which we are gaining skills, knowledge, predispositions, virtues in order to become autonomous, develop our own voice, and develop our own life plan. If we believe that childhood conforms to these characteristics, then we argue that the goal of youth sport is to help children in the quest for autonomy. Right? That should be the main point of youth sport, and that coaches, officials, parents should help in that quest through sports, while children gain relevant sports skills and develop predispositions and virtues through sports participation. So or at least seems to be central that coaches, without forsaking their authority, promotes opportunities for children to exercise their autonomy in issues they are capable of. Right? Coaching tends to be a very vertical profession in which we tell athletes what to do, and there's little room for discussion and debate and even questioning coaches' decisions. But children, as they mature, as they start to find their own voice, it would be very appropriate for them to decide, for example, how to organize play, what type of tactics to use, how to organize even practices and training sessions.
Mm-hmm.
This doesn't mean that coaches, once again, have to let children do whatever they want. Coaches have to be mindful of risks, for example, or dangers, right? Because children don't have the full capacity to um, foresee and appreciate these dangers and risks. But they do have the capacity, especially as they keep growing in sports, to make more decisions affecting their sports participation. That's what we mean with the idea of promoting agency and facilitating autonomy.
And what is the relationship, Cesar, then between having that autonomy supportive approach within your training and competition? What's the relationship between that and the uses of competition then? Is competition the benchmark or the assessment or the frame of reference that we then go back to where not yourself, Sean or Timmy or Lucy, their self-regulation that it's working, so they go through a further, or it's not working, so they go through a further process of self-creation or development? How does competition come back into that then? If you can clarify.
Well, competition provides one more avenue in the whole process for self-discovery and self-creation and self-reflection.
Okay.
But we don't have to forget the process by which we get to competition, all the training. So why do we have to focus just on the weekend? Because at least in the past, the weekend was when competition happened, right? So you train during the week and then you compete during the weekend. But we have to take into account the whole process, not just the weekend, right? But it is true that when you compete, you are testing your abilities in relation to someone else's abilities. So that is significant to see whether you have improved, whether you are stuck, whether you realize what you need to improve, and so on. Now, children need guidance here because they might think that they need to improve X, whereas the external view of the coach with more experience, with more mileage, I say, well, maybe it's not just X, but also Y and Z.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But ultimately, the idea is that children reflect on what they are capable of doing in order to improve. And competition gives you a measure. Now, there are two measures that you get in competition. People tend to believe that it's only one measure, right? You get a testing measure, say, well, how able I am at soccer, for example. But then you get a contesting measure, which is how do my soccer skills compare to my opponent's soccer skill? So you have testing skills and you have contesting skills. So competition is significant from that perspective, from the cooperation, from the mutuality, from uh, facing, working with an opponent. But significant doesn't mean the most important element. If we look at youth sport holistically, every aspect of it is important.
Mm-hmm. And what to play devil's advocate then just says that what when you're talking about there's different measures, and I agree with that. What's your response then to the opposite opinion where we may be able to tell that and we may be able to run with that as adults, but when you put children into environments where there's stores, and how do we get around the potential for them to only see one measure? Because I wonder if that's where it becomes a bit. This is where the tension arises. Is that where with all the best intentions and the best viewpoints that we can put forward to the kids, sometimes performance and learning don't go hand in hand if performance is seen as that in a zero sum way, and that a competitive environment does give nothing at times other than a zero sum. You have won and loss in the eyes of a child, because I think that's one of the problems that coaches have. So I mean, I work in an academy space where you are thinking longer term with a kid. You tell them about taking risks and these sorts of things, but they will still come off the park more often than not. At times feeling discouraged based on the last 5 minutes where they conceded a goal, and everything else that comes before then is sometimes gets forgotten about. But then I don't know if this isn't necessarily even maybe an argument against this perspective, but is this just the case that we need to get this perspective in earlier, and maybe because I'm thinking you're thinking kind of holistically, and you mentioned that word, and I also see sometimes the problems with competition has been an ecological problem, because we create the environments and the kids are given opinions and viewpoints that we lend to them as coaches or as parents. But that's I'm just wondering what's your opinion around the tensions, because that's the hard part, because it's very hard to convince children sometimes to see things the way you want them to. So where do we get to with this perspective because of that?
Well, it is hard. It is very hard because coaching is, um, in this sense, a profession that is strongly related to teaching, to education, and that's very tough, right? It's difficult. It takes a lot of patience, a lot of effort. So yes, there's going to be disappointment. There is going to be disillusionment, but that is all part of the process. So I don't think that this is an argument against the view that we are opposing. I think that is an argument to actually reinforce our efforts to help children see competition in its full complexity.
Mm,
The- Now, of course, you mentioned an ecology. Now, children, turn on the TV or watch at their tablets or any other device to follow professional games, and that's what they see, right? So the larger culture is not conducive to the view that we are promoting, the mutualist view of competition. But what's the alternative? to give up, drop our hands, and
Mm,
say, that's it. As an educator, I can't do that. So perhaps this is another element to reinforce that when a coach takes a mutualist approach to competition, the role of the coach as an educator becomes even more prominent, more visible.
mm,
And being a teacher, being an educator is no bed of roses,
mm,
right? And we have to we have to come to terms with this,
mm,
that this is difficult, that there's going to be resistance, that it is a long process, and
mm,
that the fruits are not seen sometimes overnight.
mm.
It takes one many long nights to see the fruits of this perspective.
And is
One
that,
suggestion,
yeah, yeah,
sorry, Mark, to interrupt,
yeah,
but
no, continue.
one suggestion is to not work in isolation, but rather work in teams and to form communities. So if you're coaching a team that is part of a league, maybe it's a good idea to convene the leaders of the league and try to come to some basic understanding about the perspective of competition that is going to be taken during a season, during
Mm,
a league. We tend to focus on our own team. But what
mm,
if after a match, after a tournament, teams get together to reflect together on what they did right, on
mm,
what they did not so well, on what they can improve.
mm-hmm.
So we need
Make
to
it,
use a
yeah,
little bit
yeah.
our imagination here to think outside the established structures.
Mm,
As you say, I get to the park with my own bus, we shake hands, we play, we go home. Well, what if we do things in a different way in order to promote this self-reflection, this
mm.
collective reflection? Um, you know, uh, we have to be more creative.
Yeah, no, it's, I mean, there's 2 points in there that are quite interesting because I totally agree. Actually, I would probably again say if I put all the head coaches and even all the parents in a youth league, and one by one I said to them, "What's your values and those sorts of things?" And they would probably come back with saying that they care about all the things that we're speaking to, but it's when you put them all together and into a contested space, and when players are engaged in the competitive sport, it can take one bad tackle, it can take one misunderstood word, it could take one misconstrued action to all of a sudden just create huge separation. And the separation seems to be based on what you're saying, Cesar, that it's what maybe drives this more individualistic, that, or even in a team space, sort of comparative to other speed teams, still individualistic individual teams where their own values are getting put above the opponent, and this sort of mutualist philosophy is actually saying no, we need to respect each other and the efforts of performing correctly and the efforts of achieving excellence means not advantage seeking. It means trying to care for the people that you are ultimately using as tools to get better. Um, and it is interesting. I can see it again. For me, it's always trying to say, right, now we need to think about how we coordinate that. Then, but it maybe is maybe a message to national governing bodies within sport, to the people that can help coordinate that better, that conversation. Um, Rather than it must be very hard for us at the bottom up to do that. That coming together in different. It's a different club, is like a different tribe, and even in a community setting, it's hard.
But maybe it's not a one-way avenue. It's a double-way avenue. It's from the bottoms up, from tops down
Mm,
simultaneously.
mm, both things.
Um, think about, for example, small gestures. when a contest starts, people take to shake hands, right? But most of the time, we go through the motions, right?
Mm,
But what if you stop to reflect for a second how remarkable it is that both sides have come together the same day at the same time to share the same activity?
mm,
We should be thankful to our opponents for allowing us to have a contest. Right?
mm,
So instead of simply going through the motions, is let's reflect, and at the end we can reflect again,
yeah.
right? That that in this culture in which, going back to the to one of your first point, in which there is this idea of runaway individualism, we still have this practice of sport in which when we compete, we are becoming a unity, a
Mm,
meaningful unity that sure tries to distinguish the two parts in terms of who's better. But in order to do that, you have to come together. And if there is
mm,
no opponent, there's no match possible.
mm.
So
I'll tell you straight away, most certainly the kids I work with, or any kids, to be honest, shaking hands with opponents like a chore. You're told to do it. They get it done as quickly as they can, and then they turn away from them. They separate again, and
because it
you know,
becomes a chore,
yeah,
it is not something meaningful any longer. Why not sharing a little meal
mm,
afterwards, or maybe the cool down process? Why not do that together with the other team and do
mm,
the stretching together and have the children lead the stretching session
mm,
and the
mm,
cool down session, right? And share experiences and share emotions and let them resolve whatever might have happened during the game, maybe with a little facilitator. But why did I get so upset after that tackle? Or what's the best way to resolve the trash talk that
mm.
happened during the game? Right? So when you emphasize on the educational aspect of competition, you start to see more opportunities to appreciate the mutualist view of competition and provide children with more opportunities for agency development. In the
Yeah.
process, they develop their skills, they improve their mastery, and they they socialize as well.
Mm,
In the end, I think that one point to highlight here is that coaches are providing an opportunity for children to engage in an activity that they hopefully will continue throughout their lifetime. So it doesn't stop there. I like to see coaches as people who open up opportunities for a lifelong engagement, love affair with physical activity.
mm,
Uh, and physical activity can become at the very heart of a meaningful life. Not
mm,
the winning or the losing, but the practicing of basketball, of tennis, or soccer, or swimming. Right? It's
mm,
something that I look forward to because it makes my life better.
mm,
And it makes my life better with others because competition is never individual, never ever. I understand why people talk about individual sports, but there are no such things as individual sports. When you engage in competitive sports, you depend on your opponent and your opponent depends on you. So it's
yeah.
always collective. And that's remarkable in this age of individualism.
Mm. It's actually, I mean, that is such a powerful sort of way of seeing things in a way, actually, Cesar, because you've what you've basically went to is almost like a sort of moral code of how you would want to live, and again, how would you want to treat your neighbour? And it's like sport is a microcosm of society, and that this gives us a view for how we can work together to build a better society. And I don't think that's something that has to be muted in performance spaces. This again, which is as you spoke about earlier, we're still in the pursuit of excellence. It's still in the pursuit of standards. And actually, I think if we pause just for a moment around the community aspect and how we can think more widely and largely about involvement and continuous involvement in sport, returning to what I think is one of the things that is a bit of a hypocrisy. I see a lot of coaches or parents or whoever these stakeholders, but we'll focus on the coach who, with all good intentions, will try to reduce the acknowledgement of the score or competition and who is better, who is worse on the day, as a means of protecting the child and looking after their well-being. But if as you've spoke to, you've looked more at the macro level and the longer term game, and actually what is the responsibilities of the coach as a teacher, as an educator, we risked, and this is a little bit of just my personal opinion, we risk creating fragile, in some ways weak, or in some ways ill-prepared adults if we do nothing but validate and do nothing but shelter them from experiences that right now can suck. You know, it's not nice to see a kid upset, and we don't want that, and we're not intentionally trying to go out and do that. But are we doing a disservice by removing them from any sense of danger, any sense of need to be introspective that you've as you've already explained, Cesar, is so fundamental to the self-development and that introspection that that mediates that process. We could be creating the next generation who isn't capable of actually recognizing their own excellence, because everyone gets the same thing. And it's like we're attaching the promise of the same outcome when there's different levels of capacity or excellence, or the things that we know we should be really talking about and shouting about in the process of that. And we're removing a very direct, tangible metric for measuring that. And again, not in a way to separate, but in a way to give everyone further information on where they stand in their own journey of self-development. And it's like, I think that children sometimes need to come back from sport feeling a bit upset. They need to learn about these things so that they can build a better and more reinforced and stronger self. It does get taken advantage of. And I suppose this comes back to this tension I think you've alluded to, of that this is complicated, isn't it? But this is, yeah, I see that. And this is, at least in my interpretation of that, marrying that also with the really well-intended, almost religious sort of approach of community and how you look after people. Can we dig into a bit more about the details of what are the components to this mutualist view? Because we've spoke a little bit about sharing that space and appreciating your opponent. What about things like, because you do break it down for us in some of your writing, around like the rules and integrity, and there's an aesthetic part to it. Could we speak a little bit to that? Because I think that for the coaches that are listening, that gives further tangibles that we can sort of try to latch onto a little bit and target directly.
Yeah, that takes us to a theory of sport that is known as interpretivism. And we can argue that mutualism is part of that perspective. In a nutshell, interpretivism says that in addition to the rules of sports and the social conventions, there are principles inherent to sport without which a sport is not fully coherent and comprehensible. Now, these principles are presupposed by the practice. For example, the rules don't say that you have to respect your opponent. The rules don't say that you have to see your opponent as a moral equal, that you have to try your best. But without these ideas, we don't have the best interpretation of competitive sports. The mutualist view comes in with the idea of the mutual quest for excellence through challenge. Excellence here is defined in terms of the particular skills that are characteristics of a sport. There are two different types of skills: constitutive skills and restorative skills. Constitutive skills are those who are used during the open phase of a game. For example, in soccer would be dribbling, shooting on goal, passing, trapping the ball, marking, tackling, etc. Restorative skills are those who are used after an interruption to the game. And they are the throw in soccer, a corner kick, a penalty kick, a free kick, and so on. These skills form the foundation for the standards of excellence of sport, right? And they also constitute the aesthetic dimension, because these are the properties to which we go back all the time. We compare our performance in terms of this standard of excellence. Do I possess the relevant skills? And what's my degree of possessing these skills in relation to my opponent? So there's always a dynamic of moral values and aesthetic values in this interpretivist approach to sport. So when you engage in competition, it is not optional. There's no way out. You need to be respectful of the rules. You need to be respectful of your opponents, the officials. You need to perceive your opponents as moral equals with the same interests you have in a fair contest. So there's a concern for justice. But at the same time, there is a concern for the aesthetic dimension of the game. You want to become better at the skills that define and characterize the sport. So it's this combined moral aesthetic compound that we are introducing children to and that they grow into.
Mm-hmm.
And under this perspective, once again, let me reiterate this: it is not optional to be fair, to be respectful, to be caring, and to commit yourself and devote yourself to excelling at these skills, because that's what the sport is about.
Mm.
So uh, coaching is at the same time moral teaching and aesthetic teaching. You cannot separate the two. They go hand in hand. So I know that this is maybe unusual for coaches to think about, but they are teaching at the same time moral values and aesthetic values when they are coaching, and appropriately so.
So when you speak, just what you're getting me thinking a little bit is around the aesthetic component, because one of the things that again is sometimes leveled at, I'm not going to say overuse anymore, because I think as we're speaking, this is about the misuse and the misinterpretation of competition. I think in terms of the language we use here, we need to get away from this overuse of this misuse. But and one of the misuses of competition, perhaps because if it becomes too zero sum and too about getting more than the opponent, sometimes the way the game is played maybe moves away, subjectively speaking, from perhaps the more purist, more positive, more helpful developmentally way that we maybe see sport in the way that it should be played in terms of offensive or whatever. But again, is that in itself something that should be celebrated too? Because how can you learn things around strategic, thinking in a match? How can you learn things around decision making when you're up, decision making when you're down, unless we see different styles that to some extent are aiming towards an outcome? Because if there isn't an intention to win or an intention to equalize, how would you expose in a very real, powerful intention to do it and not, try to do it? If there isn't something that's as tangible sometimes as there is a score and you could win or you could lose, how would they be able to see and then teach kids and develop them within a space of strategic planning and decision making that is real, that will actually help them in sport as they progress, or again outside the sport, if you think about the wider benefits of this. What's your view around that? Is that aesthetic? I don't know if I'm misunderstanding the aesthetic part, but it's making me think that way.
I don't want to demonize the zero-sum element in competition, right? But we have to see the intention to win, which is fine, as an attempt to achieve excellence.
Mm-hmm.
So then the celebration becomes not a celebration of just winning, but a celebration of having achieved excellence, and having achieved that excellence in together with someone else. So we are never excellent in isolation. We are excellent in a togetherness,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what we should celebrate then is not simply the winning, is uh, the communal aspect of excellence, the learning, um, the community, right? So the intention to win is not in itself problematic. The question is, why do you want to win? And if it's simply to become victorious and to dominate my opponent, well, that seems to be quite different than if we say, I want to win because I'm aspiring to achieve excellence.
Mm. Yeah,
So
so
how we rationalize these things is extremely important, especially when working with children. So the problem is not to try to win. That's fine, but it's why do you want to win? And in the process, what are you willing to do? And what are you willing to sacrifice or not? What are you willing to emphasize or de-emphasize?
that
So
must make for a very sorry, just one thing, Cesar. That would make for a very powerful conversation, because I would imagine the response you get when you ask that question, why do you want to win? That must open up so many doors to conversation around, why they're there in this excellent conversation. Because I think that'd be so interesting to ask. Why do you want to win? I don't think as coaches we ask that question. We assume that we know the answer to that question, but that's going to open up a door to teach that development for that kid and the wider moral stuff around this.
very good. And what you are saying, Mark, I think that it's a great example of how asking that question, which we assume the answer to, gives an opportunity to embark young people in a mutualist view of competition. Now, of course, we don't have to call it like this with children on the field. Right? We don't have to say, today we're going to learn about the mutualist view of competition. No, it is about saying, well, why do you want to win? What is your motivation? And what is the role of your opponent in your desire to win? And what are you willing to do? What are the limitations to what to your behavior in terms of your desire to win? So we have an opportunity. And sometimes it sounds like a cliche that a challenge is at the same time an opportunity. But I think that in this case, it is. And instead of assuming that we know the answer to this, if we are coaching a team sport, it will very good at the beginning of a season to start with questions such as this. What do we want to accomplish? Right? Um, why do we want to win? And collectively set goals and, and show children that there's an alternative to this either or, win, lose, win at all costs framework. That it is a much more, it's a richer, healthier, more just practice competitive sports when we embrace it in this way, that we get so much more out of it. But it takes, once again, we mentioned patience before. It takes patience, effort, working with others. Right? This should be a collaborative effort. We should involve parents too in this process. It's not just the coach and the kids, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we're talking about a community, this should be a communal effort as well.
Yeah, which I suppose the kids' engagement with that philosophy is only going to go so far as their parents also support it, because and a lot of evidence points to that the coach only has so much influence over a sport participant, or the mum and dad, that the parent is always going to dominate that that adherence or lack thereof. But yeah, I couldn't agree more, to be honest. Cesar, I think what you're presented us with here is that it's offering a defensive competition that can't be easily poked at as being a typical, not with the kid's best interest at heart, this sort of the egotistical, the sorts of labels that's often put at anyone who praises competitive spirit in youth, because it's just such a strangely tense area. And I think what you're giving us here is a framework that, as coaches, we can rewire ourselves to start to not think about what taking away competition does to help children, but actually what taking away competition does to disservice them in some ways, and disservice and reduce and saturate the opportunities that we can have to teach them wider lessons in the pursuit of excellence and growth and agency and all these other things. And if we can't control that, if we aren't helped in some ways, but tops up by our national governing bodies, we need to take charge in some way, if it's at a community level, to develop a more cooperative ethos with other teams, and to really emphasise the parts of game day that I think we do see as chores, if it's to do with how we interact with opposition, the time we spend with them, to stop seeing them as opposition, but see them more as collaborative partners. So thanks so much. I'm conscious that we've got very limited time. If I could just very quickly ask you, why should coaches care about the philosophy and the philosophical arguments? Because they're surrounded so much with the empirical evidence and the empirical arguments. What is it about your way of seeing things that you think is useful that we could enlarge into a wider audience here, coaches?
Because in everything coaches do and say, there's at least an implicit vision, theoretical vision of that they are implementing. The more aware they are of what they believe in, they would be in a better position and they would be more effective. And there's no way to challenge your views if you don't reflect on them. So instead of assuming, well, we should, like we ask our young athletes to do, coaches should also self-reflect on what they do, why they do it, and what are they doing for. So it seems to me that a reflective coach is a better coach. And asking all the time why I'm doing this, how can I do this better, helps coaches be more successful. So I think that is inevitable. If you care about what you do, you need to be asking these sort of questions.
Yeah. No, Cesar, thanks so much for coming on and sharing that insight. It's absolutely fascinating. I could speak to you about this all day, but I'm aware that you're already very forgiving and generous with your time. So thanks so much for that, Cesar. Hopefully for those that were listening enjoyed that even half as much as I did. And yeah, so yeah, just again, Cesar, thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity, Mark. I really enjoyed the conversation, and all best wishes with your podcast.
Thank you. And for those that are listening, guys, I will see you next time.